Thank you for this reordering of the speaking assignments. This is the end of a long day. I don't want to test your patience too much, so I'll keep it very brief, and if there are questions, then I can elaborate on some of the arguments. So what I'll do is I'll just use some, I'm an economist. Economists like to use pictures, so I'll use some pictures to express the central argument of the paper. The central argument of the paper is that Pakistan's growth has run its course. The growth events that were giving Pakistan growth in the past, they seem to have run their course. You will see that starting the early 1990s, the trajectory of Pakistan's growth lies consistently below India's, even though before 1990s, the trajectory of Pakistan's growth was consistently higher. Now, what were these growth events? We know that for 100 years, we had irrigation-supported growth in the rural areas. Following that, following 47, we had import substituting industrialization. Then we had the Green Revolution technology, and then we had remittances, which is a double-edged sword. It does well for households, but it doesn't do very well for the macroeconomy. There's a tendency for countries to have a Dutch disease, which means they become non-competitive. In fact, throughout South Asia, we have to combat that problem, including here in India. Now, this is a table that I use in Pakistan to motivate the audience. I say, let's do a comparison of India and Pakistan and just see what was the size of the economy in 2006, and if at current projections in 2020, what will the economies look like? Pakistan GDP, 14% of India's in 2006, 9% in 2020. Pakistan GDP per capita as a percentage of India's about the same in 2006, half in 2020. What does dollar value of 1% GDP spent on services in India? It was 7 billion and 22 billion in 2020 in Pakistan. So it increases threefold. In Pakistan, it goes from 1 billion to 2 billion. Now, when I make this presentation in certain stakeholders in Pakistan, I delete the word services and I just say defense, and that catches people's attention very quickly. Okay, I think we got stuck here. Okay. Now, so what is going to give Pakistan the kind of growth potential that it has, given its resources, including human resources? Of course, modernizing the current structures will be critical. But beyond that, what is the big story that you can tell about Pakistan? And in order to tell that big story, Pakistan has to dig back into its past, or the region that constitutes Pakistan now has to go back into its past. And for those of you who enjoy reading history, I would strongly recommend a book written in the 1930s by a historian, Buddha Prakash. It's called Glimpses of Ancient Punjab. And using Mahabharata, the Greek historians who accompanied Alexander, and the Persepolis inscriptions, and the writings of the Chinese Buddhist scholars who visited, he constructs a beautiful image of Punjab in that period between about 1,000 years before the arrival of Central Asian Muslims. And it's a fascinating account, and we can see that the region that now constitutes Pakistan has had initially the Achaemenian, the Persian influences. And in fact, regions to the west of Indus are still heavily influenced by the Persian historical influences. Then after then comes the Central Asian Turkic influences. And much of Pakistan's northwest, on both sides of the Indus, including Punjab, all of Punjab, including India's Punjab, is heavily influenced. And those of you familiar with history will remember Turko-Shahis, who were Buddhists, and later on Hindu Shahis, who were obviously Hindu, and they had their empires there. So these influences were mixed, and then of course we had also had Chinese coming in, and then combined with the influences from the east, the region is a perfect khichdi, is a perfect amalgamation of influences from the west and the East. And what did this cultural mix, this ethnic mix do? We begin to see in the sort of 11th century onwards, there are these four very strong regions in what now constitutes Pakistan. We have the northwest region centered around Peshawar. We have the central region centered around Lahore and Multan. And then we have the upper Sindh region. And these regions were enclaves of considerable prosperity. And not only material prosperity, but also cultural richness. The Sufi tradition spawned from these areas. The language, Urdu language, spawned from these areas. And of course, the dress and the cuisine, etc. It comes from the mixes, these 4 or 5 cultural, historical traditions that converged in these 4 regions. And these 4 regions, what were they doing primarily? These 4 regions were connecting people, cultures, and markets in the East with people, culture, and markets in the West. And in the process, enriching themselves enormously. Although it's tucked away in the northwestern part of the larger South Asia, but it has had a huge influence on the rest of South Asia precisely because it was a mixture of these different influences. Now, I want to come to it a little bit later. Now, what happens is that the British colonial period starts to change this pattern. The imperial rivalries with Russia resulted in Afghanistan coming up as a buffer state. Central Asia became part of the imperial Russian empire and influences. So that bit of that free mobility, which enriched this region, disappeared. Britain really had no interest in continuing the old Persian influence on this region. So, and the Persian roads, the infrastructure was never invested. The infrastructure that connected the upper Sindh region to Iran, that infrastructure was allowed to go out of use, and traffic and trade, etc., diminished enormously. So these regions, which were at one time the center of connectivity, they became peripheral to South Asia. However, there was a lot of development going on in the British Raj, so they were part of that. The irrigation system started, etc. So they benefited from public policy and public investment and being integrated with the rest of South Asia. But then differences with India, starting over trade issue disputes initially, and then subsequently snowballing into all kinds of other issues, they intervened, and then so that by the late 1950s, Pakistan, despite the fact that its coastline is actually a fraction, if you measure it, is a fraction of the size of its overall boundary, most of its trade is with the world through the coastal point of one single point of Karachi. Recognizing that, the early economic managers of Pakistan invested very wisely in connecting north and south. For the first time in history, there was an Indus Basin market, a very thriving Indus Basin market, and goods and people. And the largest Pathan city is not Peshawar. The largest Pathan city is Karachi. So goods and markets, finance, they began to flow up and down through until recently, perhaps the best connected part of South Asia, best connected regional segment of South Asia. And this generated a lot of prosperity. And there's the first diagram that I showed you, which was where Pakistan's growth trajectory lies consistently above the Indian growth trajectory, is a result of those investments in connecting north and south. Now, clearly, that growth momentum has run its course. Admittedly, there are military issues, there are internal political instabilities, there is macroeconomic difficulties, all of these are there. But if you look at the big picture, those really big growth vents have run their course. Pakistan now needs to go back to history and be the connectors of the East and West as it was before. And the reason why it makes a lot of sense for Pakistan to do that is because countries that lie outside its land borders have changed. India is no longer trapped in its 3%, what you yourselves call the Hindu growth rate. It's galloping away after this little blip that we've had. It'll resume growth at around 7%, 8% or so. And the potential to continue to grow at that rate is considerable. A billion plus economy, people plus economy growing at 7% to the east, a billion plus economy growing at 8 to 10%, and Western, you see, for as long as Chinese growth was taking place on the Pacific board, it was not really relevant for Pakistan. But now China emphasizing growth in its Western regions, China is practically next door. So a billion plus economy growing at 8 to 10% in the north, a Central Asia with its enormously rich mineral resources, Iran with its rich mineral resources, Pakistan is now sitting in the middle of a region where it cannot afford to be isolated from, as it did in the past. Now, one has to see recent moves of India-Pakistan trade liberalization in this context. It's really because India has done well that India is now attractive to Pakistan. It's really because China is investing in Western China and the old Soviet yoke on the Central Asian republics is gone, that it becomes very attractive for Pakistan to play the historical role that it played to connect the markets to its east with the markets to its west. Now, there is a segment of opinion in Pakistan that says, why bother with India? If you've got Central Asia with its rich mineral resources, you've got Western China growing the way it is, that's enough. We can connect the two. And the argument there is that that makes Pakistan a T-junction. The dynamics of T-junction is very different from the dimensions of a crossroads. And therefore, East-West connectivity is very important. Now, of course, I'll come to that a little bit later. We need to play this out very carefully because Pakistan's economic relations are not going to be normal economic relations. A lot of other emotion and baggage comes into that relationship. And this graph just captures how China and India have just completely taken off from low trajectories to much higher trajectories. Right up to the mid-1950s, India was Pakistan's largest trading partner, but it could not be sustained. Despite the first Kashmir war, etc., India remained Pakistan's largest trading partner. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with this, although it's a very interesting graph. So the point is, if Pakistan plays this right, and if India plays this right, what Pakistan has in store for it is the possibility of becoming initially a trade and transportation hub, and subsequently, because of its large labor force, subsequently a manufacturing hub. And what this picture tries to do is to capture that. Now you have juxtaposed on the north-south corridor the east-west linkages, and the flows, the economic flows that will come out of that in terms of labor movements, goods movement, and financial movements is enormous and are discussed in the longer paper. Now, what will it take? Of course, Pakistan, I'm very aware of what Professor Mooney says. Of course, stability inside Pakistan is going to be critical. And of course, what my friend said earlier, internal politics of Pakistan, a stable system of governance which delivers services is going to be very important. A stable Western border. Pakistan has a deep interest in a stable and prosperous Afghanistan. And a new national security paradigm. Not one based on territorial disputes alone. Territorial disputes will not disappear overnight. They'll be there. Question is, which part of the stove do you put them on? Are they on the front burner or the back burner? So a national security paradigm where the front burner has economic development, economic prosperity, internal political stability, and stabilization of the Western of the Western borders is going to be critical. Most important, forward-looking regulation. What we don't want is economic war starting between India and Pakistan. And if trade just gets restricted to trade in goods, so that there are gainers and losers alone as a result of these new trade opportunities, people will cry foul. And those who cry foul are usually much better organized than those who benefit from these things. So it'll have to be a modern-looking regulatory system which promotes intra-industry trade. In other words, we should have the ASEAN model in mind, or the European Union model in mind, where the Airbus is not just manufactured entirely in France. You have got parts and components manufactured in Germany, parts and components manufactured in Italy. I don't know which component, but I presume in England also. And it's the coming together of all of that which creates a stake in all of the players. And before the financial crisis, recent financial crisis, it promised the kind of prosperity that people had in mind when they created the vision for the European Union. So what Pakistan is now doing is, ministries will never have that capacity. Ministries will need to find a way of working with the private sector in order to develop that capacity. And what Pakistan Business Council, which was established 10 years ago, it's the collection of the largest corporations in Pakistan, they have started to engage with the government. 2 years ago, they produced a report on liberalizing trade with India. The bulk of their recommendations were accepted, and I'm told that the decision finally to go ahead on it, to a large extent, was based on the recommendations of that report. The Pakistan Business Council is as I speak, they are updating that work, and they're updating that work focusing on 4 or 5 critical areas that I will elaborate.
We're really getting short of time now.
Okay. So let me just conclude by saying that Pakistan will have to play its role, and during the discussion time, I can also say a little bit about the role India will need to play in order for this to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.